The smell of sawdust and old oil usually brought Dean peace. But tonight, the workshop felt like a tomb. His calloused fingers trembled as he pressed a hidden latch on the bottom of Helen's jewelry box. A secret compartment he hadn't known existed in 30 years of marriage. Inside lay a bundle of letters, the ink still sharp and dark, mocking the pristine memory of the woman he had buried. As he unfolded the first page, a stack of bank slips fell to the floor, revealing figures that didn't match their life of struggle. Each one dated and signed by the man who owned half the town. Outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe echoed from the yard, where his son, Caleb, was splitting wood. Dean looked through the grime-streaked window, watching the boy's silhouette move in the fading light, searching for a familiar curve of the jaw or tilt of the head he had always claimed as his own. A sudden, cold realization settled in his chest, heavier than any engine block he had ever lifted. He gripped the edge of the workbench until the wood groaned, realizing that every pillar of his life, his marriage, his legacy, and the very blood in his son's veins, might be nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. Dean McAllister crossed the threshold of his workshop, where the air hung heavy with a stagnant suspension of sawdust. Morning light pierced through the grime-streaked windows of the Elk Creek garage, illuminating the dancing particles in sharp, golden shafts. The silence of the cavernous room felt absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the wall clock and the distant, muffled hum of a town beginning its day. Dean moved toward the massive workbench, a slab of dark oak scarred by decades of labor. On the far edge sat a simple wooden frame. He reached into the pocket of his greasy flannel shirt, withdrawing a soft cloth. With a movement so light it barely registered, he drew the fabric across the glass. Under his fingertips, the face of Helen emerged. That soft, familiar smile, and the playful crinkle around her eyes, captured in warm sepia tones. Dean went still, inhaling the scent of aged lumber and a ghost of lavender soap that seemed to emanate from the very surface of the photograph. A heavy-set client in an expensive wool overcoat slapped a palm onto the blueprints spread across the workbench. The man's voice carried the sharp edge of entitlement as he muttered about how the old methods of Dean's ancestors were a waste of time and an unnecessary drain on his budget. Dean straightened his back slowly, feeling the muscles in his jaw turn to stone. His fingers gripped the edge of the tabletop so hard the knuckles turned a ghostly white. Without a word, Dean rolled the blueprints into a tight cylinder and thrust them toward the man's chest, his chin jerking toward the exit. His gaze, cold and unyielding, caused the wealthy man to stumble over his next sentence. Dean remained silent, a statue of suppressed fury, until the echo of the man's footsteps finally faded behind the heavy oak door of the workshop. The bell above the door gave a thin, mournful jingle, announcing Walt's arrival. The old man's shoulders looked fragile under a worn jacket, his frame stooping lower than Dean remembered. Walt leaned heavily on a cane, his breath escaping in a series of wheezes and rattles that sounded like a pair of rusted bellows struggling to move air. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity against a face that had grown gaunt and pale. Dean set his chisel aside, stepping toward his old friend, noticing the visible tremor in Walt's hands. Walt cast a paranoid glance toward the windows facing the street, gesturing for Dean to move closer into the shadows of the back room. A suffocating silence descended upon the workshop, punctuated only by Walt's intermittent, wet cough. When Walt whispered his plea for a private conversation, Dean felt a cord of dread tighten in the pit of his stomach. Walt lowered himself onto a rickety stool, his fingers digging into his own knees as if trying to anchor himself. He refused to meet Dean's eyes. His voice sounded like dry parchment as he began a rambling tale about the local sawmill and its powerful owner, James Carter. Dean's brow furrowed, unable to grasp why this dying man was wasting breath on a business partner they had both known for years. Then Walt uttered Helen's name, and the atmosphere in the workshop seemed to plummet into a deep, icy chill. The words about secret meetings, about a clandestine affair that had spanned years, hit Dean with the force of a physical blow to the gut. The walls of the workshop began to press inward. Walt described details, specific dates, locations, the silver ring, that only a confidant could know. Dean watched his entire history dissolve into a heap of ash. Walt finally lifted his head, and Dean saw a nauseating mixture of pity and ancient fear in those watery eyes. Walt spoke Caleb's name, and the sound made Dean flinch as if struck by a lash. The old man spoke of dates that didn't align, of a timeline Dean had never questioned. And finally, the claim that Caleb's biological father wasn't the man who had raised him, but James Carter. A roar began to build in Dean's ears, a white noise that drowned out the rest of Walt's rasping confession. Caleb's image, his crooked smile, the way he habitually pushed hair from his forehead, flashed before Dean's eyes in a new, distorted light. Dean gasped for air, finding the taste of sawdust suddenly intolerable, while Walt continued to pour out the poisonous truth. Rage erupted in Dean's chest like molten lead, staining his vision a dark, bruised crimson. He lunged forward, his large hands knotting into the fabric of Walt's coat, shaking the old man's frail body with terrifying force. Dean's fist cocked back, hovering inches from Walt's hollow cheek. But he froze when he saw the deathly pallor of his friend's skin. With a guttural snarl, Dean shoved Walt away, sending him stumbling back until his spine hit the doorframe. Dean ripped the workshop door open and physically hauled Walt onto the sidewalk, ignoring the cane that clattered to the pavement. He slammed the door with such violence that the glass panes rattled in their frames, and he threw the heavy bolt, locking the world out with 3 sharp turns. Dean returned to the workbench, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He tried to focus on a piece of premium mahogany intended for a high-end commission, but his hands, usually steady and precise, shook uncontrollably. He picked up a carving tool, but the metal skated across the polished wood, gouging a deep, jagged trench where a delicate scroll should have been. He stared at the ruined workpiece, a knot of suffocating self-loathing tightening in his throat. The sound of the tool hitting the floor rang out like a gunshot in the empty room. Dean dropped his head into his hands, his fingernails digging into his palms, while the smell of fresh timber mingled with the scent of his own sweat and the cold, rising fear of what lay ahead. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, bathing the house in thick gray shadows when Dean finally crossed the threshold. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, hunched over a textbook, the overhead lamp casting a soft gold glow over the back of his neck. Dean froze in the doorway, his eyes boring into the boy's profile. He searched the line of Caleb's jaw, the bridge of his nose, and the shape of his eyes for any trace of James Carter. Caleb looked up and offered a warm smile, but Dean saw only a stranger's features where he used to see his own. His heart constricted with a sharp, stabbing pain when he saw Caleb reach up and brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead, the exact, unconscious gesture Helen used to make. As soon as the front door clicked shut behind Caleb, Dean headed for the stairs. He entered the master bedroom, where the air felt preserved in amber, still carrying the faint, floral trace of Helen's perfume. He turned the key in the lock, severing his connection to the rest of the house. The room remained in a state of perfect, frozen order. Starched linens, neatly arranged bottles on the vanity, and pillows that had not been disturbed for years. Dean stood in the center of the floor, feeling like a desecrator in the shrine he had built to his own grief. The silence of the room pressed against his eardrums, while he stared at the bed where a woman who had become a stranger had once slept. Dean lunged at the wardrobe, his fingers hooking into the doors and yanking them open until the hinges groaned. His hands moved with a frantic, feverish energy, tearing through silk dresses and wool sweaters, tossing them onto the floor in shapeless heaps. He ripped drawers from the dresser, emptying their contents, lace undergarments, stockings, and folded scarves, until the room was a chaotic sea of fabric. His breathing became heavy and erratic as he began thumping the back panels of the furniture, searching for hidden compartments. He didn't notice when he knocked a vase of dried flowers from the nightstand, sending it shattering into 1,000 ceramic shards. He was a man possessed, transforming Helen's sanctuary into a battlefield in his desperate hunt for the truth. Dean stopped in front of an old, intricately carved jewelry box Helen had kept for decades. His fingers searched the interior, pressing against the velvet lining until he felt a slight, mechanical give at the bottom. With a sharp push, a false panel popped upward. Tucked beneath a wedding photograph of the two of them standing under an old oak tree, he found a thick bundle of letters bound with a faded ribbon. He pulled the stack out, surprised by the physical weight of the paper. The scent of old ink and dry, aged parchment hit him as he stared at the handwriting on the top envelope. His fingers trembled as he tore into the first envelope, the sharp edge of the paper slicing a thin red line across his thumb. His eyes raced over the neat rows of script, recognizing Helen's elegant hand immediately. The words spoke of heated nights in a hunting cabin by the creek and contained declarations of love for another man that burned Dean worse than a hot iron. He crushed the yellowed page into a shapeless ball, his knuckles white. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears, and images of that small cabin with the sagging roof, the place Helen claimed to go for gathering medicinal herbs, swarmed his mind. He realized he had been a fool, breaking his back over a workbench while she was in the arms of the town's wealthiest man. Dean emptied the rest of the hidden compartment, revealing a stack of bank deposit slips held together by a thick rubber band. The blue ink on the slips remained crisp and clear. He checked the dates, noting with a sickening precision that the deposits coincided perfectly with the years his own family had struggled to pay the heating bill. He counted the zeros in the deposit columns, a bitter, jagged laugh escaping his throat. Each figure felt like a deliberate insult. These handouts from Carter had tripled Dean's best annual earnings from the workshop. A cold, hollow sensation spread beneath his ribs. The very roof over their heads, the clothes on their backs, and even the shoes on Caleb's feet now seemed tainted by the smell of betrayal and another man's charity. Dean descended to the kitchen where Caleb was focused on a plate of eggs. He leaned against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the way Caleb held his fork and the slight, characteristic wrinkle of his nose before he took a drink of water. In every movement, Dean now saw the spectral shadow of James Carter. The same set of the head, the same heavy, deliberate turn of the shoulders. Caleb went still, sensing the feverish intensity of the stare, a drop of yellow yolk freezing on his chin. Dean clenched his teeth, feeling a wave of visceral revulsion toward the young man's face, which had suddenly become nothing more than a map of another man's genetics. Caleb asked timidly if Dean was feeling ill, but Dean pushed past him, his shoulder clipping the back of the boy's chair. He didn't offer a single word, ignoring the rising alarm in Caleb's voice as he retreated to the garage. The air there smelled of motor oil and cold iron. Dean reached behind a row of toolboxes and pulled out a dusty bottle of bourbon he had been saving for a better day. The cork came away with a dry snap. He took a long, punishing swallow straight from the bottle, not even flinching as the liquid scorched his throat. Caleb knocked on the garage door, his voice muffled and pleading. But Dean only pulled his cap lower and took another long drink, letting the alcohol begin to dull the fire in his chest. The sun was well past its zenith when Mr. Gilmore's polished black sedan pulled up to the workshop gates. The client leaned on his horn for a long minute before getting out and pounding on the locked door, shouting demands to see the progress on his inlaid cabinetry. Dean sat on the floor among the wood shavings, staring at a single knot in the floorboards, refusing to move. On the workbench above him lay the unpaid lumber invoices and the final notice from the electric company, items that now seemed like meaningless scraps of paper. Gilmore eventually gave up, shouting threats about legal action and canceled contracts. But Dean only watched the dust motes dance in a stray beam of light. The reputation of McAllister and Sons, built over 3 generations, was dissolving into nothing, and he found he didn't care. Dean stepped into the local grocery store for a loaf of bread, the bell above the door announcing his presence to the quiet room. Old Mrs. Green, who had been chatting at the counter, went silent instantly and began a sudden, intense study of a can of peas. Dean felt the weight of the other shopper's stares sticking to his back like wet mud. The clerk handed over his change without once meeting his eyes, and in that heavy, awkward silence, Dean read the truth. The whole town had known. They had watched him play the fool for 20 years. He grabbed his bag and walked out, the hushed whispering resuming the moment the door began to swing shut. The pity of his neighbors felt more agonizing than a physical assault. At the entrance to the post office, Dean nearly collided with Sarah, Helen's closest friend. Sarah dropped a handful of mail, her face turning the color of bleached bone. Dean saw her pupils dilate with a sharp, sudden terror as he took a step toward her. In that panicked look, he found his final confirmation. Sarah had been the gatekeeper, the one who helped hide the trysts and perhaps even delivered those bound envelopes. He stared at her in grim silence, and the woman began to back away toward her car, leaving her mail scattered on the pavement. He realized the circle of deception had been far wider than he ever imagined. A conspiracy of silence that included everyone he thought he knew. The air inside the old mill bar was thick with blue tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled beer. Dean slammed his palm against the scarred wood of the bar, demanding another double whiskey. When a news segment on the television above the racks of bottles showed a clip of James Carter at a charity event, Dean snapped. He began to shout, calling the man a thief and a coward, his voice cracking as he used every foul epithet in his vocabulary. The other patrons went quiet, turning to stare at the man who had always been the town's most stoic resident. Dean knocked over his bar stool and continued his tirade, his face purple with rage and drink, while Joe the bartender tried to wave him down. Tom, a man who had once been Dean's apprentice, placed a steadying hand on Dean's shoulder, trying to guide him toward the door. Dean's reaction was instinctive and violent. He spun around and delivered a sharp, heavy blow to Tom's jaw. A chaotic brawl erupted instantly. Blinded by a lifetime of repressed hurt, Dean tore through the bar. He grabbed a heavy glass mug and hurled it with all his might. He missed his target, and the glass smashed into the massive mirror behind the bar. It shattered into 1,000 gleaming shards, each one reflecting a jagged, distorted version of Dean's face. The sound of the crash briefly stunned him, but he lunged back into the fray, his fingers locking into the collar of Tom's jacket. Sheriff Miller finally forced Dean's arms behind his back, pinning him against the wall while Dean struggled, leaving smears of blood on the floor. Dean's breath came in ragged gasps, his shirt torn open, a dark bruise already swelling over his eyebrow. The sheriff led him out of the bar, into the cool night air, passing through a gauntlet of judging faces. Neighbors who used to tip their hats now shook their heads in collective disappointment. Dean stumbled over the threshold, the shame of the town's gaze burning worse than the alcohol. The legacy he had spent a lifetime protecting was officially buried in the dirt outside a dive bar. Dean stumbled into his house, the stench of stale whiskey and sweat clinging to him. In the living room, he found Caleb standing by the door of the master bedroom. The boy's face was a mask of pure horror. He was staring at the ransacked wardrobe, the piles of Helen's clothes trampled by Dean's muddy boots, and the letters scattered like autumn leaves across the floor. Dean saw Caleb clutching one of the pages, his knuckles white, and realized the boy had finally read the truth for himself. Their eyes met, and in Caleb's expression, Dean saw not just pain, but a reflection of his own unraveling sanity. Dean walked past him without a word, making no effort to explain or offer comfort to the person he no longer recognized as his kin. Dean locked himself inside the workshop, the heavy iron bolt sliding home with a definitive thud. He grabbed the desk telephone, his fingers trembling with a cold, focused malice. He dialed James Carter's private line, the one listed on the back of the bank's slips. When the man answered with his usual air of bored authority, Dean didn't identify himself. He simply began to speak, his voice a low, vibrating growl of threats and accusations. He promised to burn the sawmill to the ground, to strip Carter of everything he owned, to make the town scream his name in shame. He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He slammed the receiver down and stood in the dark, the silence of the workshop feeling like the inside of a tomb. Dean opened his eyes to find his cheek pressed against the cold concrete floor. A thin layer of old sawdust clung to his skin. A heavy hammer seemed to be beating against his temples from the inside. Outside the thin walls of the workshop, a brass band suddenly erupted into a loud, jarring march. The boom of the drums and the shrill notes of the trumpets, signaling the start of the Black Gold Festival, felt like hot needles piercing his brain. The morning light was unforgiving, illuminating the chaos of the room and the spilled cans of varnish. He tried to push himself up, but the floor felt like the deck of a ship in a storm. His mouth tasted of copper and cheap bourbon, a physical manifestation of the previous night's self-destruction. He managed to sit up, bracing his back against a heavy workbench leg. Through the haze, he saw Caleb. The boy was on his hands and knees in the center of the floor, painstakingly gathering fallen chisels and placing them back into their velvet-lined cases. Caleb's fingers shook as he tried to align the torn edges of blueprints, a futile attempt to piece back together the shattered remains of Dean's life. The sound of Caleb's boots treading on the spilled grit felt deafening. The boy didn't look up, but his shoulders were pulled tight, and a dark smudge of soot or dried tears marked his pale cheek. The workshop, once a temple of craftsmanship, now looked like a graveyard, where Caleb was the lone, desperate mourner. Dean reached for a half-empty bottle wedged into a vise, but Caleb was suddenly there, his hand clamping down on Dean's wrist. The boy's grip was unexpectedly powerful, bordering on painful. Caleb's breathing was heavy as he stared directly into Dean's bloodshot eyes, his usual submissiveness replaced by a hard, desperate edge. He gestured toward the letters on the floor, their edges curled from the dampness of the night. Caleb's voice vibrated with a raw, jagged tension as he demanded to know the truth of every word Helen had written. Dean felt the heat of the boy's hand on his skin and found the contact repulsive, a reminder of the man whose blood might actually be pumping through those veins. Dean ripped his arm away and scooped up a handful of the remaining letters, hurling them at Caleb's chest. The papers caught the air, fanning out and striking Caleb's face like tiny, sharp-edged blades. Dean's voice rose into a ragged, guttural roar that drowned out the festive music drifting in from the street. He spat out accusations of shame, shouting that he had wasted 20 years raising a stranger's bastard. Caleb stood perfectly still as the letters fluttered to his feet like dead leaves. His face went white, then settled into a hard, stony mask. A dark, unfamiliar fury flickered in the boy's eyes, a fire born from the ashes of his destroyed world. Dean lunged forward, his fingers digging into Caleb's shoulders with bruising force. He shook the boy, his own face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He screamed that Caleb was nothing but a living reminder of a lie, a parasite who had fed on the McAllister name while his real father sat in a mansion on the hill. Caleb didn't pull away this time. He leaned into the aggression, his own teeth bared. The air in the workshop felt thick and combustible, charged with a lifetime of unspoken resentments that had finally found a vent. In the heat of the confrontation, Dean's arm swept back, catching a heavy canister of solvent sitting on the edge of the bench. It hit the floor and burst, sending a clear, pungent liquid racing across the concrete toward the wood-burning stove. A stray spark, perhaps from a forgotten cigarette or a faulty wire, found the fumes. There was a soft, terrifying whoomp as the air itself seemed to ignite. A wall of blue and orange flame erupted between them, fed by the dry sawdust and the stacks of seasoned timber. The fire climbed the walls with predatory speed, turning the workshop into a roaring furnace in a matter of seconds. Dean dove into the oily, opaque wall of soot that was rapidly consuming the room's oxygen. The searing air scorched his lungs, forcing him to double over and press a wet scrap of his shirt against his face. Around him, the ancient floorboards groaned and popped with the sound of gunshots. Massive shelving units, laden with heavy planks of ash and cedar, buckled and collapsed, sending plumes of sparks into the dark. He clawed his way through the debris, guided by a thin, muffled moan coming from the back of the shop. Orange tongues of fire licked at his boots, and the black smoke blinded him, turning the familiar space into a lethal maze of heat and falling timber. Dean fell to his knees in front of a pile of wreckage, where Caleb lay pinned beneath a fallen oak cabinet. The piece of furniture, once a point of pride for the workshop, was now a burning trap crushing the boy's legs. Dean wedged his shoulder under the charred edge, feeling the skin on his palms hiss as the heat blistered his flesh. His muscles screamed under the strain, the veins in his neck bulging as a low, animal growl escaped his throat. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, he heaved the massive weight upward, clearing enough space for Caleb to drag himself out from under the smoldering frame, while burning embers rained down on Dean's back. With a desperate surge of strength, Dean hauled Caleb's limp body over his shoulder, the weight nearly buckling his knees. The acrid smoke of burning varnish and chemicals filled his throat, triggering a violent, racking cough. He stumbled blindly toward the rear of the building, his boots tripping over glowing tools and mounds of hot ash. When the silhouette of the jammed oak door appeared through the haze, he didn't reach for the handle. He slammed his entire weight into the wood. The door splintered and gave way, and the two of them tumbled out of the inferno and into the cool, damp embrace of the morning mist. Dean gulped in the wet air, the scent of pine and dew never tasting so sweet. Dean collapsed onto the damp grass, feeling the cold earth draw the heat from his battered, scorched body. Caleb lay beside him, chest heaving, his frame racked by violent shudders. Behind them, a long, agonizing groan of twisting metal and groaning timber signaled the end. The roof of McAllister's legacy buckled and fell inward, sending a massive pillar of fire and soot into the sky. Dean didn't look back at the destruction of his livelihood. He watched only the rhythmic rise and fall of Caleb's chest. The orange glow of the fire flickered across their faces, while black ash drifted down like a somber gray snow. In the sudden silence that followed the collapse, Dean held his hands out in front of him. The skin was a map of angry red burns and gray soot, his fingers twitching with the aftershocks of the ordeal. He stared at the smoldering ruins where the carved boxes, the secret compartments, and that cursed stack of letters had all been reduced to carbon. He felt the poisonous bitterness that had been rotting his insides for days begin to lift with the smoke. The ash falling around them felt oddly clean. In this gray world, his hatred had finally burned itself out. leaving behind a profound emptiness and the heavy scent of charred wood. Dean reached out a trembling hand and rested it on the back of Caleb's head, pulling the boy toward his shoulder. He could smell the fire in Caleb's hair and felt the boy's fingers lock into the fabric of his burnt jacket. Dean leaned close to the boy's ear and whispered the word, "Son," his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The word felt like a heavy anchor being dropped into the foundation of their new reality. Caleb flinched, and then Dean felt the boy's hot tears against his neck. For Dean, the dates on the calendar and the bank slips no longer mattered. In that moment, he accepted that fatherhood was forged in the fire, not in a laboratory. Dean sat on the hood of his old truck, a heavy folder resting on his knee. A real estate agent stood before him, extending a pen. Dean took one last look at the blackened scar on the earth where his workshop had stood and signed the sales agreement with a quick, decisive flourish. He didn't haggle over the price or look back at the charred remains. He was deliberately cutting this piece of land out of his soul. When the agent began to talk about the potential for rebuilding the foundation, Dean simply shook his head and walked away. The plot had become a graveyard for a lifetime of lies, and he had no intention of building a new monument upon it. Dean pushed open the heavy glass door of the clinic, ushering Caleb into the sterile, air-conditioned lobby. The air smelled of alcohol swabs and floor wax. Dean filled out the forms for the genetic testing in silence, aware of Caleb's questioning gaze. He wasn't doing this because he still doubted. He was doing it to pull the last thorn from the ghost of the past. When the nurse pricked his finger, he didn't even blink, watching the dark bead of blood form. He knew the test was just a formality, a necessary step to finally bolt the door on the cellar he had so recklessly opened. A week later, Dean pulled a thick envelope from his mailbox. Caleb stood on the porch, his entire body tense as he watched Dean's hands. Dean turned the paper over, feeling its smooth, cold surface. Without breaking the seal or even holding it up to the light, he handed the unopened results to Caleb. A small, tired smile touched Dean's lips as he saw the confusion in the boy's eyes. By refusing to read it, he was finally stripping the paper of its power. He didn't need a lab report to tell him who was standing in front of him. Caleb gripped the envelope, and Dean saw the boy's shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Dean placed a thick stack of cash on the kitchen table, the bills still bound by bank bans. It was the entirety of the money from the land sale. He pushed the pile toward Caleb, whose eyes darted from the money to Dean's face in disbelief. Dean spoke of the university in the city and the architecture program Caleb had always dreamed of. He watched Caleb's fingers tentatively touch the money and knew this was the price of the boy's freedom from the shadows of Elk Creek. Dean nodded, answering the unspoken question in Caleb's eyes, and felt a strange, buoyant lightness, as if he were the one being given a second chance. Dean climbed into the bed of the truck, where a set of heavy iron vices and a roll of chisels lay wrapped in old canvas. These tools, which had belonged to his father and his grandfather, were the only things that had survived in the metal locker beneath his workbench. He ran a hand over the cold steel of a saw, feeling the familiar weight of it. Everything else, the furniture, the chipped plates, the dusty rugs, he left behind in the house with the doors standing wide open. He slammed the tailgate shut, the sound of metal on metal acting as a final punctuation mark. In the cab, he had only a road map and a thermos of coffee. Dean turned the key, and the truck's engine turned over with a deep, familiar rumble. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, staring into the side mirror at the receding silhouette of the house and the black, empty space where the workshop had been. Dean didn't look back. He shifted into gear and steered the truck toward the highway that led out of the valley. As the sign for Elk Creek disappeared behind a bend in the road, The weight that had been crushing Dean's chest for 20 years finally began to dissipate. He looked at the road ahead, realizing that for the first time in his life, he was truly unburdened.